Is Mike Green right for the Falcons at 15?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman, aka Mr. Drew, aka Sirius Black, aka Mr. AKA, and I've been covering the Atlanta Falcons for a very long time, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong on this illustrious podcast. And I thank each and every one of you that go strong with me as everydayers. That means you make this podcast your first listen or watch each and every day. And all you have to do to become an everyday or subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts to get the latest episode as soon as it is available. So today we're going to be talking about one of my favorite former Falcons retiring, talk about his legacy. And since it is Combine Week, we'll start the conversation about how important testing is going to be for evaluating various positions, including the pass rushers. But our Combine coverage won't really kick off in earnest until Wednesday. And so, since most of you will be listening to this on Monday, that means it is another illustrious Mock Draft Monday. And over the past week, I looked at 15 prominent mock drafts. And the vast majority of them, all 15 of them, had the Falcons taking a defensive lineman in the first round or a pass rusher in the first round. But the two guys that seemed to be on the majority of those mock drafts were Mike Green and Mykel Williams. Mike Green of Marshall, Mykel Williams of Georgia. And Mike Green was on 6 of them. Mykel Williams was on 4 of them. And I was like, okay, well, the majority rules. Let's talk about Mike Green today. And Mike Green is a player that I know a lot of Falcon fans are excited about. I think they see a lot of the production that he had, led the nation this past year with 17 sacks at Marshall, went to the Senior Bowl, had some viral moments, right? Had that viral moment where he was able to put Josh Connolly, the Oregon offensive tackle, on his butt with a nasty bull rush. And that was one of the 2 questions we had of Mike Green going into the Senior Bowl. It was like, how much power does he have? And then the other one is, can you step up against premium competition, given, much to Maria Martin's chagrin, the Sun Belt is not necessarily producing elite NFL offensive tackles nowadays. And so, he went to the Senior Bowl, checked that box with that 1 rep in one-on-ones in terms of the power, and then, performed well. Again, it wasn't amazing by any means, but was well against some of the Power 5 competition that he faced in those one-on-ones in practice. But that being said, if you recall our coverage during the Senior Bowl of Mike Green, you probably recall being like, I don't think Aaron's that big a fan of Mike Green as the rest of the world seems to be. And it's true. I've watched several games of Mike Green's, 4 games I've watched where I charted his pass rush. And I'm just mostly skeptical about how the way that he wins at the collegiate level translating to the next level. That in those 4 games, he had about 25 wins. About a third of those were counter moves. A third of those were low quality or other moves like, unblocked or cleanup pressures and whatnot. And then a 6 of those were speed rushes and a 6 of those were power rushes. And the fact that the speed rush was so low is kind of one of the issues I have, because I feel like that's Mike Green's best trait. But he's a guy that tends to win with counters, and typically you like to set those up with speed, but he doesn't really do a lot of setting those things up. And when we talk about his favorite counter move, it's the inside swim move. And the fact that you see a lot of swim moves on Mike Green's film, I think is a result of one of the concerns that people had about Mike Green and his size, which is less about the weight, but the arm length. And I think the arm length shows, which is why Mike Green is constantly trying to swim past guys in order to disengage from guys, just because typical in college offensive tackles, and it's only going to get more exacerbated at the next level with the NFL, can outreach him, and it becomes difficult when he's trying to lock out those guys to disengage from them. But, being so reliant on the counter moves, that's something that I think is hard to replicate at the next level, just because there's only really one guy that is a really highly productive edge rusher in the NFL that relies heavily primarily on inside counter moves. That's Micah Parsons. And, I think I wound up cutting out some of this in the previous episode I did with Jarvis Davis when we talked about the Georgia guys and why the Falcons should draft Georgia guys. But one of the things I think I cut out in that episode was talking about how I think certain players are getting a Micah Parsons bump in this year's draft cycle. And those are guys like Mike Green and Abdul Carter and Jalen Walker and Jahad Campbell. And with Carter, it makes sense given all the superficial similarities between Micah Parsons and him, going to the same school, wearing the same number, this position switch from linebacker to pass rusher and whatnot. But the other guys, to me, I feel like they're kind of a little bit overrated, again, just a little bit, because I feel like it's being fueled by people. Some of the hype around those guys like Green is being fueled by people looking for the next Micah Parsons. And basically what I said with Jarvis, whether it was Micah Parsons or, looking for the next Josh Allen equivalent, Micah Parsons kind of that outlier of all outliers. And, it's not a great or a smart bet, in my opinion, to bet on outliers like that. And so if you're betting on someone to be the next Micah Parsons, I don't think it's a good bet. And the other issue I have with Mike Green, and I know this is just all me just airing all my Mike Green grievances, but it's one of those things why I like Mike Green as a prospect, but I don't love Mike Green as a prospect. I'm not necessarily as oh man, if the Falcons get Mike Green at 15, like they nailed that pick. I'm not there yet. Maybe I'll get there by the time we get to April. But the other issue I have with Mike Green is the over-reliance on the inside moves, being undersized, having those short arms. It's a lot of overlap with, Vic Beasley when he was at Clemson. And I know most listeners and viewers of this podcast didn't watch Vic Beasley back in 2014 when he played at Clemson, or don't remember it. But I do. I did watch it, and I do remember that. And that's also giving me a little bit of pause because I'm just like, there's a lot of overlap with all the inside moves and all this other stuff. And again, it's probably more superficial than anything, but it's just enough to be like, there's something gnawing in the back of my mind. Now I've seen this before and it didn't quite live up to the hype. And that's part of the reason why I tend to be maybe a little bit more skeptical of Mike Green than others. But, it's going to be interesting to sort of see what his development is at the next level. I think he has a lot of the tools that you like. And so that's kind of where I'm like, I want to see, especially this week with the combine, I want to see the tools translate into him being this high-level athlete. Like on tape, he has the speed, he has the bend, he has the burst, all these things that you feel like can translate at the next level to be an impactful pass rusher. But I just wonder, how high he can get there. But I think a lot of the issues with Mike Green can be developed. So it's not as if he hasn't figured that out at this point, basically as a one-year starter at Marshall. He'll never figure it out. And it's like, that's part of the projection or whatever. But I think it'll be easier to project those things if he kind of kills it this week at the combine. We'll see how he tests. I expect him to kind of be one of the better testers in this edge class in terms of being that sort of potentially 9 out of 10 athlete. And I think that will certainly make it a lot easier for me to be like, okay, I can see the vision now when, Mike Green runs that sub 4.45 40, that sub 1.6 10-yard split, that 6.9 or faster 3-cone, that 4.2 or faster short shuttle, 36 or higher vertical jump, 125 inch broad jump or something like that. Those are kind of where I'm hoping Mike Green tests that this week. And if he does hit those benchmarks, then it'll be a lot easier for me to be like, okay, I get it now. So, the other thing that's going to be important for Mike Green this week is some of the question marks given some of his background, right? He began his career at Virginia, was dismissed after his first season there, then transferred to Marshall. And, NFL teams are going to have a better idea of what went down in that situation than those of us on the outside. But, I know because of the Falcons' emphasis on the makeup, right? And I'm sure when we get to Tuesday and Terry Fontenot speaks to the media at the combine, you will hear the word makeup every single time. We won't make a drinking game out of it because, you might die based off of that. But because of that potential situation, I've seen a lot of people speculate over whether or not the Falcons will be as high on Mike Green because of those question marks. And again, I don't have enough information about whatever that incident was at UVA that led to his dismissal to suggest that will make the Falcons out on him or anything like that. I don't know enough information, and I won't sit here and speculate on it. But it is certainly something to take a note on. But without more information and more specifics on that, it's really hard to talk about that in a definitive way. So it is something, again, just a note at this stage. If we get more information, we can talk about it maybe more in earnest and sort of how that fits with him in Atlanta. But we'll see what happens. But, the main thing we can focus on with Mike Green outside of that is sort of the tangibles that he brings on the football field. And this week, we're going to get a lot of tangible information on just how gifted an athlete he is in comparison to some of his peers. And speaking of that, that leads us to a conversation about why athleticism is so important when it comes to edge rushers and what, combine testing you guys should be paying attention to as you're evaluating the Mike Greens and others later this week. So when the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because with FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, whether it's at the opening tip-off or that fourth quarter comeback. You can stay in the action, and if you're looking for that bigger payout, you can even combine your bets into a same-game parlay. For example, for the Sunday night matchup between the Hawks and Pistons, if you took, say, Trae Young under 27.5 points, Zachary Reisha say over 12.5 points, and Dyson Daniels over 5.5 rebounds, you can win up to 5 times your money. That's why we love the same game parlays. You can bet a little, win a lot, and all you got to do is sign up over at FanDuel, and new customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for a shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. So if you've been an everydayer of this podcast for a number of years, you probably heard all this information before because A, the Falcons always seem to need pass rushers, and we always seem to be talking about this at this time of year. And B, the data doesn't really change all that much from year to year. And I talked about this a ton in sort of how we stacked those top 3 edges last year in Dallas Turner, Latu, and Jared Verse. And especially with Latu, given that I was a little lower on him than a lot of other people, because I didn't really love the athleticism that he brought to the table, and I thought that would limit him at the NFL level. And so some of the research I did last year was looking at the top 10 edge rushers in terms of pressures in the NFL in the 2023 season, and looking at their combine testing. And for the most part, those guys averaged basically being 75th percentile athletes across the board, according to Mock Draftable, in the 40-yard dash, the 10-yard split, the 3-cone, the short shuttle, the vertical jump, the broad jump, and that speed score. And that speed score, for those of you that don't know, is a weight-adjusted 40 time. And this past year, I looked at I spanned from the top 10 edges in 2023 to all the edge rushers that either in 2023 or 2024 had 50 or more pressures, and looked at their combine metrics. And of those guys, of the guys that had 100 or more combined pressures over the last 2 years, their averages in the 40-yard dash was a 4.63, which would have been 86th percentile according to mockdraftable.com. Among edge rushers, their 10-yard split was 1.61, which is 73rd percentile. Their 3-cone is 7.10, that's 68th percentile. Their short shuttle is 4.30, 78th percentile. Vertical jump is 35.5 inches, 75th percentile. Broad jump is 121, 10 foot 1 inch, which is 78th percentile. So again, right around that 75th percentile or above usually is the guys that are the high-end pass rushing producers. And again, just illustrating that the majority of the productive pass rushers in the NFL tend to be high-end athletes relative to their position group. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that you just draft players purely off of their athleticism, but I certainly think it does help that when you look at some of the more successful players that weren't first-round picks, because the vast majority of at least the guys, in the top 10 or whatever, looking at guys like Trey Hendrickson, the vast majority of those guys were first-round picks. But when you look at the guys that weren't first-round picks, that were more middle-round picks or late-round picks, guys like Trey Hendrickson, Max Crosby, Danielle Hunter, high-end pass rushers that weren't first-round guys, all of those guys scored pretty well across the board as well, especially when it came to their agility drills. And that's the part that I know the everydayers have heard me talk about many times before, that if there is one set of drills that you're going to pay the most attention to when it comes to edge rushers at the combine, it is the agility drills. It is the 3-cone or short shuttle, right? If you're going to nail it down to one, you probably nail it down to the 3-cone, right? Just because that correlates a little bit more with pass rushing production than the short shuttle. But the short shuttle is number 2. And, if a guy doesn't have a great 3-cone, but has a great short shuttle, and, Nick Bosa is a great example of a player like that, don't throw it, it's 3 cones only like 710 instead of being 6'9" something or whatever it needs to be. So it's one of those things where it's like they both matter. You just want, if a guy tests well in one of those areas, it's usually a very promising sign. So those agilities tend to correlate the most to sack and pressure production. From the research I've done continually over these last couple of years, is basically if you have a sub 7'2" 3-cone, good chances that you'll have a better chance of being a productive pass rusher in the NFL, or a sub 4.4 short shuttle. And I think the reasons for that is mostly because of Ben, right? That speed kills, right? When it comes to the NFL, the vast majority of pass rush runs in the NFL among edge rushers are speed-based moves. And simply, if you can beat that offensive tackle to his outside shoulder with that speed rush, and then bend that corner, you're going to be able to convert a lot of those pressures into sacks. And I think that's really where that shows up. But, it shouldn't be this idea of we're going to base entirely our evaluation of a player purely off the stopwatch, right? Like, the numbers do matter, but it's not just only about the numbers, right? It's basically the idea of not every good athlete becomes a good pass rusher, but the vast majority of good pass rushers are good athletes, right? And I say the vast majority because it's not everyone, because there are a couple of guys that are highly productive that are kind of average athletes. The two that kind of stand out in the research I've done is like Zadarius Smith and Greg Rousseau are two great examples of guys that didn't really tested kind of poorly in a lot of areas, or underwhelming in a lot of areas. Like Rousseau, I think, had a really good 40, but everything else was like 30th percentile or lower, and Zadarius Smith is similar. But to me, what's unique about those two guys is that they spend a healthy percentage of their pass rushing snaps rushing inside, right? Where I think that goes to show why athleticism isn't as consequential for interior rushers as it is for exterior rushers or edge rushers in this case. But I haven't done nearly as much research on, D tackles as I have done edge rushers. I wonder why, because the Falcons refuse to take edge rushers high in the draft. But it's like, it's like, oh, well, I don't need to do research on D tackles, but it may be something I'll look into later this week. But it's not to say that I don't think athleticism matters for interior guys. But I would guess, again, just based off of very, very preliminary research, but I would guess that for D tackles, it's less about being a 75th percentile athlete like it is for edge rushers, and probably more like being a 50th percentile athlete that most of the successful interior pass rushers are. And I think that probably has something to do with the difference in caliber you typically have in terms of the athleticism that guards have versus tackles have, right? Because probably like 40% of the starting guards in the NFL were college tackles that weren't athletic enough to stay at tackle in the NFL. So, I don't think you need to be as overwhelming an athlete as an interior rusher to be successful, just because you're not facing as high-end athletes that you typically are facing at the offensive tackle position. So, we'll see on that. This won't be the last time we talk about combine testing with some of these positions, especially some of these positions of need. We'll probably talk more about the edge rushers as this week unfolds and get into specifics once we get that testing a little bit later in the week. I think Thursday we'll get that testing for these edge guys. We'll probably also talk about corner and whatnot and other position groups of need for the Falcons. But to close out today's Locked On Falcons, want to give a special shout out to Keanu Neal, who announced his retirement today. And he's one of just a handful of Falcon players that I will absolutely stop the podcast to talk about as we're talking about other things. And we'll break that down and talk about Keanu Neal's legacy here on Locked On Falcons to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So this isn't the first time we've given Keanu Neal flowers on the Locked On Falcons podcast in the last calendar year. For those of you that missed it, the Falcons Historian Shootout was an ongoing series that myself, my former co-host Alan Stirk, and I did this past summer, where we, quiz people trivia questions on Falcon legends, quote unquote legends from the last 20 years, and Keanu Neal was one of those. That episode, I think, featured Myles Garrett versus Brad Rowland. I want to say, I don't even remember who won, but those are details that I do not commit to memory. But you know, I think I mentioned, so a lot of things you might hear on today's episode, basically, I talked about then. But if you want to get more into the specifics of Keanu Neal as a player, we did spend a good chunk of time, like 20 minutes of that episode, talking about Keanu Neal and our various memories of Keanu Neal. And one of the things I'm certain I said in that episode was Keanu Neal was one of my is one of my all-time favorite Falcons, right? You know, where he ranks exactly on the pantheon, I don't know. He's probably somewhere in the top 10. Probably in that 8 to 10 range, but that, you know, that list includes players like Deion Sanders and Jesse Tuggle and Jamal Anderson, the running back, you know, Julio Jones, et cetera, and whatnot. Grady Jarrett's on that list as well. So, you know, I think when it comes to Keanu Neal, for the most part, most people remember the big hits. When you'll see people posting on social media today of like remembering Keanu Neal, they'll just post like him decking Mike Evans, him decking Jimmy Graham, him decking Willie Snead, some of these more memorable hits. That's going to be Keanu Neal's lasting legacy to the vast majority of Falcon fans. But I always like to take these opportunities to talk about the other things that I remember Keanu Neal for, that, you know, you only know if you were really watching the film like that, rather than just watching the highlight stuff. And like I've mentioned this before, but it's like, you know, I think he was a very underrated coverage player. Like he was that Falcons tight end eraser in 2016 and 2017, had very memorable and successful matchups, I recall, in those years against guys like Greg Olsen and Rob Gronkowski, keeping them limited. I remember vividly that 2017 Bills game. I've talked about this before, where early in that game, the Falcons had Deion Jones kind of spying Tyrod Taylor, and Deion was kind of struggling. Tyrod had a couple of big third down scrambles to extend some drives and get some points for the Bills. And then at some point in the middle of the game, I think it was sometime in the third quarter, they made the switch to be, okay, Keanu, you're going to spy Tyrod. And Tyrod didn't have any more of those third down conversions. And that was, to me, the type of player that Keanu Neal was, where he was just kind of that X factor in their defense. He was, to me, probably one of the more important players in their defense, you know, and it's kind of the nature of that style of defense, that Seahawks style of defense, because I'm sure depending on who you talk to, there will be people that will tell you that like the more important player in that Seahawks secondary in the Legion of Boom wasn't Earl Thomas, who's the bona fide Hall of Famer, but it was actually Cam Chancellor that was the more critical piece to that component, because, you know, when you play that cover 3 defense, you got the 3, deep guys, that 2 outside corners, single high safety, and then you only have 4 guys underneath, which is 1 less defender underneath than you would if you were playing a cover 2 base defense where you had 2 deep and 5 underneath. And, one of the things about the cover 3, especially during that age, was the tendency that the ball tended to get funneled underneath. And so you needed to have more speed on your defense, which is because you needed 4 guys to cover the space that 5 guys would normally necessarily cover. And that's why that strong safety, Keanu Neal, Cam Chancellor, was so important, because he was a huge part of being able to make up the difference between having those underneath defenders. And to me, again, that's not a coincidence why when Keanu Neal got injured early in the 2018 and 2019 season with those ACL and Achilles injuries respectively, like you saw a big downturn for that Falcons defense. And again, I feel like Keanu Neal was billed as this hard-hitting safety that was struggled in coverage, but like the coverage struggles only really occurred after he suffered those injuries, sapping him of some of the athleticism that he had early in his career. And another thing that stands out to me about Keanu Neal is he's a great example of projection. He played primarily a single high safety role at Florida, but you saw sort of his impact when he did get those opportunities to play in the box, which is why he was billed as a box safety and whatnot. But one of the things that happened at Florida, playing in a really talented secondary where like all those guys, Brian Poole, Vernon Hargreaves, Tease Tabor, some other guys, and I'm sure I'm blanking on, all made it to the Marcus May made it to the NFL. But I'm sure the 5 of you that are Gator fans are like, yeah, man, it's been tough these last this last decade. But I remember vividly that he didn't play a lot of man coverage in that defense. And the Falcons took a trip to Florida to work out Keanu Neal and several of those other players on that team. Chaz Green, who's famous for giving up all those sacks at Adrian Claiborne in that one, 2018 game, was it? No, that would have been 2017 as well, right? But anyway, the Falcons went down there to work out all those Florida guys on campus, and you know this because this was during when Dan Quinn was still active on Twitter, tweeting out where they were headed, and then they sort of like, hey, Dad, you can't do that. Like you're giving out too much information. So he stopped doing that. I think probably after this Florida visit, but they worked out Keanu Neal on campus, and it showed him, despite not having a ton of experience in man coverage, that he had all the tools that they were looking for to be that sort of tight end eraser and be able to hold up in man coverage. And so I kind of liken it to the whole Michael Penix workout from last year, where the current coaching staff kind of fell in love with the player via that workout. So I imagine it was a similar situation with the former coaching staff falling in love with Keanu Neal. And it's not to sort of say that, like that workout single-handedly got Michael Penix drafted in the top 10 or got Keanu Neal drafted in the first round. But it was kind of like, they probably liked him before that. I liked him a lot. And it was kind of the period at the end of the sentence. So, another bit of Keanu Neal adjacent lore is that 2016 draft was basically the last time I got really invested in the Falcons drafting a specific player in the first round. I was all jacked up for Miles Jack. Right. I thought he was the best player in that draft class. You had the Jeff Ulbrich connection when he was the position coach at UCLA, when Jack was there, defensive coordinator, and whatnot. And we knew that the Falcons had a massive need at the linebacker position back then. They didn't want to go back to the Paul Warlow and whatnot. And so Jack had that knee injury that he suffered in season. But I think a lot of people were like, oh, he'll still go top 10. But apparently NFL teams were scared off of that knee injury, and he started to fall in the draft. And I remember with the Falcons picking their 16 on draft night, I'd be like, oh man, prior to that, it was like there was little expectation that he was going to be there at 16. But then when he started the draft, it started like, oh my God, we're going to get Miles Jack. We're going to get the best player to draft, all that stuff. And then the Falcons took Keanu Neal. And he was a player that, I liked. He was often mocked to the Falcons in round 2. But despite that, it was like it was so disappointing, right? It's like, how can you pass on Miles Jack? I like Keanu Neal, but he's not a first round player, blah, blah, blah. Deion Jones, like, he's not Miles Jack, all this stuff. And then lo and behold, 6 months later, Keanu Neal is one of my favorite players on the team. And to me, there's a lesson there, right? It's like, don't get too married to how you feel on draft night about a player or a draft pick. It shouldn't necessarily skew your perception of that player forever. And it's one of the things I try to not do on this podcast is build up the draft to be the end all be all, right? Because I remember how disappointed I was on draft night in 2016. And, looking back, and I was like, there's no reason, because you wound up loving Keanu Neal and whatnot. So it's like, there was no reason for you to be as disappointed as you were. And so, I know most Falcon fans and most fans in general will be like, I hate the pick on Thursday night. And then within like 48 hours by Saturday, they're like, you know what? I thought about it a lot more. And actually the pick makes a whole lot more sense. That's just the coping strategy of being a fan of a football team. And that's not unique to Falcon fans. That's true of all fandoms. But it's, you still have that vocal minority of people that I think tend to get very married to their draft night opinions, right? They're more invested in being right than, the team being successful with the player that they wound up picking. And I know a lot of you guys are like, Aaron, that's ironic coming from you. And it's like, you're right. I'm very invested in being right, guys. But it's only like 49%. 51% is the team success. So like, I do have my priorities in the right place. It's just, that I try to strike that balance. I got to keep that balance, right? And 51%, just barely etching out being right about things. So I wish more Falcon fans would learn a similar lesson, as you strike that balance. It's not to say that you shouldn't get invested in the draft, but don't get so caught up in the draft that you miss out on the next Keanu Neal. That's basically what I'm saying. So we will see what the Falcons wind up doing. If Mike Green is the answer to them, we'll talk more tomorrow with Alex Katzen about Younghoe Koo, so we can explore the more in-depth conversation about whether or not the Falcons should keep or cut Younghoe Koo, conversation that we did not have last week when we talked about other players on the Falcons roster that the team should keep or cut. So that is in store for you as your first listen tomorrow on Locked On Falcons. So continue to check us out on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. And for your second listen, make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft with Damian Parson and Keith Sanchez. Now the season is over. Get the latest draft rankings, rumors, and news every day, and especially this week during the Combine. Those guys are going to kill their coverage of this week in Indianapolis. So make sure you check out Locked On NFL Draft as your second listen. It is all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.